I can still feel the pain of his hands shoving me to the floor. The coldness in his eyes as he threw me out like trash lingers in my thoughts. This is what became of my 61st birthday, a day that was supposed to be joyful. Instead, I was humiliated and rejected by my own son, Henry. Henry. He used to be the center of my world. I loved him, raised him, sacrificed everything I had for him. And now he looks at me as though I am nothing, as though I'm merely a burden in his life. My entire life, I tried to be his support, even when I struggled myself. But now I've lost everything. My son has distanced himself from me, and his wife, Laura, has become the source of my deepest pain. Even hearing her name makes my blood boil. When he first brought her home, I felt something was off. Her gaze, cold and calculating, was like a knife to my heart. She looked at me as though I were an obstacle to be removed. Her whispers to Henry, her sly manipulations. I tried to warn him. Begged him to see that behind the mask of a loving wife lay selfishness and greed. But he didn't listen. He was blinded by lust, by the illusion of unconditional love. And me? I was left on the sidelines, watching as this woman destroyed everything I had built. Now, on this day, when all I wanted was a bit of warmth and love, I found myself thrown out of my own home. My son called me crazy, told me it was his house now, and threw me out. The home where I spent so many happy years has now become her fortress. I sit on the cold pavement, feeling utterly hollow. Cars rush past, their headlights cutting through the darkness. One of them stops, and out steps Nicole, my best friend. She sees immediately that something is wrong. "Megan, what happened? What are you doing here?" Her voice trembles with worry. I can't hold back the tears. "Henry. He kicked me out. Said it's his house now." Her eyes widen in shock, then narrow in anger. "On your birthday? That bastard. Megan, get in the car. You're coming home with me." I climb into the passenger seat, feeling like an empty shell. Nicole drives, glancing at me occasionally, her face twisted in indignation. This is unacceptable, Megan. Henry has no right to treat you like this. Something has to be done. Her voice is resolute. I shake my head sadly. What can I do, Nick? He's a grown man. He's made his choice. Nicole presses her lips together, her eyes glinting with fury. Maybe so, but that doesn't mean he'll get away with it. You're his mother, for God's sake. It's time Henry and that vile wife of his learned there are consequences for their actions. I look at her in surprise. What do you mean? A slow smile spreads across her face. I mean, darling, it's time for a little revenge. And I know just the person to help us make it happen. Her words awaken something in me, something long forgotten. Hope. Hope that I might regain even a piece of what was taken from me. We speed into the night, and for the first time in a long while, I feel a spark of life. The day had begun so differently. I was determined to make my birthday special, despite everything that had happened. The morning was spent cleaning the house, setting up decorations, and preparing dinner. I even bought a cake from the bakery, the same one Henry always loved as a child. Around noon, I worked up the courage to call him. My heart pounded unevenly as he answered. Hi, Mom. What's up? His voice was cold, distant, but I tried to ignore it. Henry, it's my birthday, I began, struggling to keep my voice steady. I wanted to invite you to dinner. I made all your favorite dishes. There was silence on the other end. Then he said, Laura thinks it's a bad idea. We already have plans for today. Henry, please, I begged. It's so important to me. His response was icy. Mom, you need to understand that my life is with Laura now. You need to learn to respect that." His words cut me like a knife. But I still hoped he would come. Until the very last moment, I prepared dinner, lit candles, and set his favorite cake on the table. Then I heard a knock at the door. My heart raced as I opened it, only to find him standing there with a cold expression and words that shattered my world. He called me crazy, said he was tired of my meddling in his life. And then, he threw me out. Just threw me out. Now I sit in Nicole's car, staring at the road ahead, hearing her determined words. Something in her tone makes me believe, maybe this isn't the end. I remember how my fingers clung to the doorframe as I helplessly watched Henry and Laura walk away. Their figures disappeared behind the door, but in my mind, her biting words echoed like a refrain. Toxic influence, terrible mother. The words burned my soul more deeply than anything I had endured that day. Tears streamed down my face, scorching my cheeks, while my legs, as if rooted to the ground, wouldn't let me take a step. I looked back at the room behind me. The table, lovingly set, the lasagna still sizzling in the oven, and the cake standing proudly on the counter. All of it now seemed like a pathetic theater, an attempt to reclaim something that had long been lost. I realized these family props no longer concealed the emptiness that had taken root in my life. The noise outside the window caught my attention, and I instinctively walked over to look out. Henry's car was driving away, its taillights dissolving into the evening gloom. All that remained was the quiet rustle of the wind outside and the throbbing pain in my wrist where Henry had gripped it. I looked down at my skin, at the redness left by his rough touch, and I couldn't understand how things had come to this. The pain, both physical and emotional, brought back memories. I saw little Henry, the boy with golden curls who delighted in every moment spent with me. His laughter, his joy over the smallest things, the trusting look in his eyes as he reached out his tiny hands to me. How could that child have become the man who now looked at me with contempt? Slowly, I brushed my tear-dampened hair back from my face and stepped away from the window. Too many emotions had surged all at once, and I didn't know what to do with myself. My eyes landed on the phone lying on the kitchen table. I wanted to call Nicole, but my fingers hovered over the screen. What could I tell her? That I'd been humiliated again? That I'd tried to mend relationships only to be trampled on? Instead, I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. The silence in the house, once comforting, now felt oppressive. I turned on the light, hoping it would dispel the darkness, but the room only seemed to sink further into emptiness. Even the walls seemed to bear witness to my humiliation and now stood in silent judgment. I got up and went to the kitchen. Clearing the table was the most logical thing I could do at the moment. One by one, I removed the plates, folded the napkins, and turned off the oven. The lasagna I had prepared with such love now sat cooling on the stove. I thought about throwing it away, but my hand froze over the trash can. Instead, I covered it with foil and placed it in the fridge. The cake. My gaze lingered on it. The pristine white frosting, the perfectly even layers adorned with sugar flower decorations. How ridiculous all this care now seemed. I blew out the candles without making a single wish. What's the point of wishing when all your dreams are shattered? I thought bitterly. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. Could Henry have come back? Hope flared briefly, but when I opened the door, I saw Nicole. She stood on the doorstep, her expression serious but warm. "I couldn't leave you alone after what happened," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "What's going on?" I lowered my head, unable to meet her eyes. They came. Henry and Laura. But the kids weren't with them. They said I'm toxic, that I'm a bad mother. My voice trembled, and I pressed my hand to my face to keep from breaking down again. Nicole stepped closer and pulled me into a firm embrace. Her warmth was a lifeline. "They have no right to treat you this way," It's completely unacceptable. You don't deserve this, Megan. I shook my head. I don't know what to do. It feels like I've lost Henry forever. Nicole pulled back, her eyes alight with determination. You know what we're going to do? We're going to change everything. You don't have to accept this. But how? I whispered, feeling a small spark of hope ignite within me. She smiled, but it was sly, almost conspiratorial. I have a plan. But first, you need to believe in yourself. You need to understand that you deserve respect, Megan. Her words were like a breath of fresh air. I didn't know what she had in mind, but for the first time in a long while, I felt I wasn't alone. I felt that maybe there was a way out of this darkness. The sound echoed in the empty house. The last slam of the door as Henry and Laura left wasn't just a cruel end to the day, it was something much more. It was the final punctuation in our relationship, and I stood there alone, as if the ground had vanished beneath my feet. My heart shattered into a million pieces, each shard piercing me, reminding me of how everything had fallen apart. I didn't know how long I stood there, minutes or hours. Time lost all meaning. The pain in my chest was so deep, so searing, it felt as though it might consume me whole. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I closed the door with trembling hands, barely able to stay upright, and made my way to the couch, where I collapsed into the cushions like a discarded doll. Sob after sob tore through me, shaking my body to its core. How could Henry do this to me? My son. I had been everything to him, and yet he treated me as though I were a stranger. Did all my love and sacrifices mean nothing? How had everything gone so wrong? The ringing of the phone pulled me from the depths of despair. At first, I didn't want to answer. But when I saw Nicole's name on the screen, the unbearable loneliness inside me pushed me to pick up. My voice trembled with tears as I answered. Megan, what happened? Are you okay? She asked. The worry in her voice broke through my fragile composure. I sobbed even harder and, through my tears, told her everything. Every detail. How I'd invited Henry to dinner, how he came with Laura, how she accused me, how he grabbed my wrist, how they left me there alone. Nicole listened silently, not interrupting, but I could sense her tension. When I finished, she said, Megan, this has gone too far. They have no right to treat you like this. It's time to change things. But what can I do? I asked, wiping my tears. You can start by showing them that you won't give up, she replied, her voice firm but caring. Listen, I want you to meet someone. They can help you regain control. Her words, her confidence, all of it sparked something in me. Part of me was still crushed by the pain, but another part, the one tired of being a victim, began to stir. All right, I said, trying to make my voice sound more confident than I felt. What do you mean? Nicole laughed, as if she was anticipating something significant. Meet me in an hour at the diner on the corner. I'll introduce you to someone. You won't regret it. An hour later, I was sitting across from Nicole in a cozy booth at the diner. She was smiling at me over her coffee, her eyes sparkling with a mischievous glint. So, who is this mystery person? I asked, unable to hold back my curiosity. At that moment, the door chime jingled, and Nicole raised her hands to wave at someone behind me. I turned around and saw a tall man walking toward our table. His confident stride, broad shoulders, and serious expression suggested he had seen a lot in his life. Megan, meet my brother Jack, Nicole said, motioning to the seat next to us. He's a private investigator. Jack nodded, his gaze direct and piercing. I could feel him assessing me, but there was no judgment in his eyes, only something akin to professional curiosity. Nicole told me your story, he began, leaning his elbows on the table. I'm sorry your son and his wife treated you this way. I shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, though the pain inside me twisted tighter. It's their choice, I said quietly, but Nicole seems to think you can help. His expression grew serious, even predatory. You're right, they made a choice. But, Megan, I'm confident Laura has skeletons in her closet. People like her always do. If you're ready, I can find them for you. Those words, spoken with icy calm, stirred something deep within me. It felt like the first spark of light in a long darkness. What are you suggesting? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jack smiled, and there was something dangerous yet promising in his smile. I'm suggesting we uncover what she's hiding, and use it to show them you're not broken. Jack began laying out documents, his grim expression revealing the weight of what he was about to share even before he spoke. I sat across from him, feeling the tension in the air press down on my shoulders. Nicole, seated beside me, seemed tense as well, her fingers drumming nervously on the armrest of her chair. So, Jack began, giving me a measured look. Laura isn't as clean as she seems. I dug into her past and found something very interesting. He held up the first document, a slightly worn sheet of paper with an official seal. She has a criminal record for embezzlement, he continued. A few years ago, she worked at a large company and was fired after management discovered she had been diverting client funds into her personal accounts. She avoided prison, but the case left a stain on her reputation. I felt my throat go dry. The very thought that the woman who had taken over my son's life was capable of such things filled me with a mix of anger and disgust. Jack handed me the document, and I saw Laura's cold eyes staring back at me from an old photograph. She looked younger, but her expression was the same, arrogant, almost predatory. This is just the beginning, Jack said, pulling out another folder. Her past holds an even darker secret. I held my breath as he laid out newspaper clippings and photographs in front of us. He pointed to one article, its headline reading, "Suspicious Death in Upscale Neighborhood." 3 years ago, her ex-boyfriend was found dead in his apartment, Jack explained. The police suspected foul play but couldn't prove anything. Do you know who the last person to see him alive was? I nodded silently, feeling my heart begin to race. Jack held up a photograph of Laura standing next to the now-deceased man. Her smile lacked warmth, and her gaze, that gaze was icy, almost chilling. She was, he confirmed. And while no formal charges were brought against her, her name appeared in the police report as a person of interest in the investigation. Are you saying she might have been involved in his death? Nicole broke the silence first. Her voice was tense, her hands clenched into fists. I'm not claiming anything definitive, but when you connect the dots, it's suspicious. We have reason to believe Laura isn't who she pretends to be. A shiver ran through me. These revelations turned everything upside down. Laura, whom I had despised for manipulating Henry, now seemed far more sinister. Could my son be in danger? Or had he already become her next puppet? What do you propose we do with this information? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Jack leaned forward, his eyes alight with resolve. We have powerful ammunition. We can use this to put her in her place. She needs to understand that her actions have consequences. And Henry, he needs to know who he's tied his life to. Nicole looked at me, her face a mixture of excitement and concern. Are you ready for this? She asked. I nodded slowly, feeling a new strength rising within me. No longer would I be a victim. No longer would I let Laura and Henry trample over my life. What's next? I asked. Jack smiled that dangerous smile of his. Next, we act. Henry stormed into the house like a hurricane. His face was contorted with rage, and his voice cut through the air like a blade. What the hell have you done? He snarled, slamming the door shut behind him. I instinctively took a step back, trying to process what was happening. His arrival was sudden and jarring. "What are you talking about, Henry?" I asked, striving to stay calm even as my insides churned. Henry turned to me, his eyes blazing with fury. "Don't play dumb. Laura told me everything. About the private investigator, about you digging into her past. Did you think you could blackmail her? That this would make me apologize to you?" His words hit like a hammer. I froze, feeling a surge of hot anger and cold fear wash over me at once. "Henry, you don't understand," I began, but he cut me off. "No, Mom, it's you who doesn't understand. You've gone too far. Laura is my wife. Do you think you can interfere in our lives, threaten her? Do you even realize what you've done?" I clenched my fists to stop myself from trembling. "What I've done?" I said sharply, feeling the anger bubbling to the surface. "Me? Really, Henry? You and Laura have taken everything from me, my family, my grandchildren. And now you have the audacity to accuse me?" Henry stepped aside, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You just can't leave us alone, can you? Everything has to be about you, everything has to revolve around you." His words felt like a slap in the face. I felt my eyes well up with tears, but I refused to let them fall. "And you?" I whispered. "You can't see the truth, Henry. You don't see who Laura really is. Or maybe you don't want to see it. I tried to protect you. Yes, I hired a private investigator. But do you know why? Because I was afraid for you. Because I knew something was wrong with that woman. Afraid for me?" He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "No, you just can't stand that I chose her over you." Those words broke something inside me. I couldn't hold back any longer. "You don't understand, Henry. Laura isn't who she claims to be. She has a criminal record for embezzlement, and that's not all. Do you know she was implicated in the suspicious death of her ex-boyfriend? The police couldn't prove her guilt, but that doesn't mean she's innocent. Is this the woman you trust with your life?" Henry froze, his face a mix of shock and rage. "You're lying," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore. "Look at the facts, Henry," I pressed on, sensing that my words were finally piercing his armor. "Do you even know who she is? Or do you choose to ignore it because the truth is too inconvenient?" He turned away, as if trying to process what he had just heard. His shoulders tensed, as though he were fighting an internal battle. "And even if it's true," he said at last, "it doesn't change anything. She's my wife. And you're just a mother who can't let go of her grown son." His words felt like a knife to my heart. "If I wanted to control you, Henry, I wouldn't have let you go when you chose her," I said, my voice steadied despite the pain. "I stayed out of your life until you both started destroying mine. But you made your choice. Now I'm making mine. I won't let you treat me the way you have anymore." He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes that resembled pain. But it lasted only a second before anger reclaimed him. "You'll regret this, Mom," he said coldly, heading toward the door. "You'll regret starting this war." He left, slamming the door behind him. I was alone, standing in the silence, breathing heavily as I tried to process everything that had just happened. My heart ached, but along with the pain came another emotion, determination. If Henry wasn't ready to see the truth, would make him see it, even if it meant losing him forever. I stood my ground, lifting my chin, feeling a wave of resolve pulsing in my chest. My body was tense, but I couldn't afford to break. I couldn't let this man, my son, destroy what I had been trying to rebuild for years. "I didn't blackmail anyone," I said firmly, each word echoing in the empty house. "I simply made her understand that her actions have consequences, that she can't destroy my life and go unpunished." Henry exploded. His face, already red with fury, grew even more tense, and his voice became cold and detached. He turned to me with that insufferable air of superiority that stretched my nerves to the breaking point. "Destroy your life? Are you serious?" he roared, nearly boiling over with rage. "You're the one trying to destroy our marriage, our family, with your constant meddling and manipulations. And now what? You're trying to play the victim?" Those words, spoken with such cruel confidence, cut into me like a knife. I clenched my fists, feeling anger rise in my chest, hot and blinding. The pain from his words was heavy, but I knew I couldn't stop. The words spilled out of me like an avalanche, unstoppable and fierce. "I'm not the one who turned you against me, Henry. That was all Laura. She's poisoned your mind, and you can't see that she's a criminal. A liar, maybe even a murderer." For a moment, his face froze, and I thought I had finally broken through his defenses. He stood motionless, as if he couldn't believe what I had just said. I felt the silence fill the room, weighing heavily on me. But then, as he regained his composure, his expression became as cold as ice, and his voice was utterly devoid of emotion. "You're unbelievable," he said, his words slicing through the air like a blade. "You really think I'd believe your insane accusations against my wife, the mother of my children?" It felt like a punch to the stomach. My heart clenched, and the world around me seemed to freeze. But I knew I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let this nightmare continue. "They're not accusations, Henry. They're facts," I replied, striving to keep my voice steady despite everything. "Jack found evidence." Henry took a step back, his face going blank as his hands balled into fists. His eyes darted around the room, and I sensed he was on the verge of unraveling. He had always been too proud to accept the truth, but this was more than pride. It was a complete denial of everything I was saying. "I don't care what your private investigator found," he snapped, his voice turning icy. "Do you think this changes anything? Do you think, after everything you've done, I'm going to listen to you?" Each accusation hit me like a weapon, cutting deeper as he tried to justify his cruelty. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain to him that I wasn't just throwing out accusations? How could I make him see that Laura wasn't just a mistake, but someone who had destroyed everything I had tried to build? I raised my head and looked into his eyes, searching for even the smallest spark of understanding. But there was only indifference, coldness. I knew then that he wouldn't hear me, not now. He had already made his choice. Henry turned and walked to the door without another word. I stood there, unable to move, feeling everything inside me collapse. The moment your own child rejects you, when you lose him as if you were sand slipping through your fingers, leaves a void that nothing can fill. I felt the air grow heavy, his words continuing to echo in my mind like dull blows. And yet, I knew I had to keep going, not for him, not for Laura, but for myself. Finally, the day came when we walked into the police station, heads held high, ready to expose Laura's past. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like I could feel its rhythm in my fingertips. We were here to take back some control, to show Henry and Laura that they would eventually be held accountable for everything they'd done. The detective was already at his desk, and his expression became focused as we began to present our case. He listened carefully, occasionally nodding, sometimes jotting down notes, but not a single word was missed. There wasn't a shred of doubt on his face. We laid out all the documents, photographs, and witness statements in front of him. Everything had been meticulously prepared to leave no room for doubt. When we finished, the detective leaned back in his chair, frowning. He continued reviewing the papers, flipping through pages as though trying to comprehend what he might uncover. I felt the tension mounting with every passing moment. My eyes stayed fixed on his face, hoping his reaction would be what I had been waiting for. "This is serious," the detective finally said, tapping his finger on the stack of documents. His eyes stayed fixed on us, and I felt the weight of his gaze amplify the pulse of fear and hope in my chest. If what you're saying is true, we have grounds to reopen the investigation. I exhaled, and the breath felt like liberation. It seemed as though the crushing weight that had been pressing on me all this time had finally eased, even if only slightly. He began meticulously reviewing each point, each detail, like someone who understood the gravity of the moment but couldn't afford to be hasty. "This could change everything," he said, setting one of the photographs aside and slipping it into a folder. "If Laura is truly guilty, we will take action." I felt my shoulders relax slightly as he nodded and assured us he would take control of the case. "Very well," he added, meeting our gaze. "Leave this to me. I'll get to work." We left the station, and with every step, I felt the air charged with more than just words. There was a tangible sense that this injustice could finally be set right. Everything was unfolding before my eyes, and I couldn't believe we had truly reached the point where Laura and her lies would be exposed. Inside me, a pulse of anticipation began to grow stronger. Once outside, I stopped and glanced at Jack, whose face reflected quiet satisfaction. This was a moment of victory. 3 days later, I received a call from Jack. His voice carried a tone of solemnity, with an unmistakable note of triumph. "Turn on the news," he said, and I felt something spark in my chest, like an electric current. I quickly grabbed the remote and switched to the main channel. The news anchor's voice was upbeat, as always, but when the segment about the reopened investigation into the death of Laura Wilson's former boyfriend began, it became clear this was just the beginning of what was to come. The anchor spoke of new evidence, the renewed investigation, and Laura Wilson being the focus of an inquiry that painted her not only as a liar but as a potential criminal. I stared at the screen, my soul filled with a mix of relief and vindication. I knew Laura wouldn't give in easily, but this was only the first step. Everything I felt at that moment was like a volcano on the brink of eruption. I stood there, looking at Henry, trying to process the words he had just spoken and how deeply they had shaken me. He kept talking, but I could no longer hear him. My thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing became painfully clear: his pain, his helplessness. It was everything I had once longed for from him when I was dying inside, left alone. But now, I was as composed as ever. I know I said horrible things, but this is bigger than that." Henry's voice trembled, and it seemed as if he was holding back tears. "Laura is in real trouble. Mom, the evidence against her is bad." A flash of realization shot through me. I froze, unable to respond immediately to his words. "What are you saying?" My heart raced. My thoughts were a tangled mess, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Everything Jack and I had discussed, all the hope for justice, it felt like it was unraveling right before me as I stood before my son, who suddenly seemed to be on the other side of the divide. His voice cracked as he tried to maintain a shred of dignity. "I don't know what to do," he continued, his eyes filled with despair. "The legal fees alone are bankrupting us, and if Laura goes to prison, I can't raise the kids on my own. I need you, Mom, please." His words cut into me like a cold knife. I could feel his pain, his turmoil, but deep inside, something screamed in protest against everything he was saying. He stood before me, broken, his eyes hollow and desperate. I looked at him, wondering, can I trust him again? Can I open the door to someone who so ruthlessly cast me out of his life? He stood there as though torn apart inside, caught between wanting to comfort me and needing my help. But I couldn't forget how he had turned away from me, how he had erased all my suffering and care when Laura came into the picture. I stood still, holding back the tears that threatened to fall, clenching my hands into tight fists. "You should have thought of that earlier," I said with icy calm, enunciating every word. "Before you turned your back on me, Henry." He looked at me with a pained expression, but I couldn't stop. I had my truth, my pain, and I couldn't let him lie to himself or to me any longer. "I'm sorry, Henry," I said, feeling the words weigh heavily on my tongue. But this, you'll have to face on your own. My voice was firm and cold, and I felt each word cut into his soul, breaking him. I turned away, feeling my body tremble, but forcing myself not to look back. He could no longer be my salvation. He had made his choice, and now he would have to live with it. I walked past him without paying the slightest attention to his pathetic attempts to beg for forgiveness. His words, his apologies meant nothing to me anymore. I could no longer trust his words as I once trusted his promises. His pain, his pleas, his suffering, all of it could not erase what he had done. Now, he was on her side, on Laura's side. As I left the house, my steps were firm and confident. The anger still simmered within me, but now I knew I wasn't alone. I had my own strength, and I was determined to use it to reclaim at least a part of what had been taken from me. I wouldn't let them walk over me again. I straightened my back, refusing to show even the slightest hint of unease, though inside, I felt like a storm was raging. Meeting his gaze coldly, I fought to maintain my composure, for there was no room for weakness in that moment. I couldn't allow myself to pity him, despite his suffering, despite his words. He had made his choice, and now he would have to live with it. I told myself this, but the weight in my heart remained. "Everything will be fine," I said with effort, trying to infuse my voice with confidence. "Enjoy your weekend." He nodded without another word and left, the sound of the doorbell echoing behind him. Once again, I was left in silence, alone, but not entirely. I was with the children, my little islands of solace. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to smile. I had to pull myself together. I had to forget, even briefly, what had happened in the past few weeks. I needed to find happiness, even for a moment, in the joy these little faces brought me. I turned to the grandchildren, who were already taking off their shoes. "Who wants pizza for dinner?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful. The children erupted in excitement, their laughter immediately filling the room and driving away any lingering gloom. Their joy, their radiant eyes, it was exactly what I needed in that moment. These were the times when I could forget all the pain, at least for a while. I could leave behind the disappointments, the heartache, and the shattered hopes. The weekend passed in a blur of laughter, games, and happy stories. My grandchildren played, racing toy cars across the floor, while I sat nearby, watching them and losing myself in their simple joy. For those moments, nothing else mattered. Their laughter was like music, a balm for my wounded soul, and their little hands reaching out to me for help were like soft blankets shielding me from all the cruelty of the world. But it ended too quickly. When Henry returned, the air in the room grew heavy again. He arrived just as the children were packing up their toys and saying their goodbyes. His expression was guarded, tense, as though he knew something was wrong and dreaded what he had to do. He said nothing, simply stood by the door, watching the children run to me to grab their things. My granddaughter, as always, came to me and tugged on my hand. "Grandma, can we come back to visit soon? We had so much fun." Her voice rang like a bell, and I couldn't help but smile, despite the ache in my chest. I stroked her hair, trying not to show how hard this was for me. I wished this time would never end, that there would be no goodbyes, no ominous reminders that Henry and I were strangers once again. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, hugging her tightly. "Anytime you want." But Henry didn't let us enjoy that small moment of joy for long. His jaw clenched, and I knew it was time for them to leave. "We need to go," he said in a tone so cold it made me press my lips together. Everything in his voice felt distant, detached, and in his eyes, I could no longer see the boy I once loved. All I saw was a man torn between duty and something I could no longer understand. The children, unaware of the tension, clung to me one last time. Their small faces looked sad, and I watched as they reluctantly said their goodbyes, their smiles fading with each step toward the door. I stood there, watching them leave, feeling the world close and around me once more, sensing the weight of loss in these small farewells. In that moment, I realized that in these fleeting moments of love and happiness we shared, I was losing far more than I could ever hope to find in this cruel world. The courtroom was packed. The air was heavy with tension, palpable in every corner. Each word spoken seemed to leave an indelible mark in the hushed, echoing space. I sat behind the prosecutor, trying not to betray my anxiety. My heart pounded painfully, a heavy weight in my chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation. This moment had come, and I couldn't believe I was here, that all of this was happening to us, to my family. Laura was led in by her wrists and ankles, her hands bound with iron cuffs. She looked utterly drained, her face pale, her eyes sunken, yet they still burned with that fierce fire I once knew all too well, hatred and contempt. When our eyes met, I felt a cold wave wash over me, but I didn't look away. I couldn't. I had to stay strong. Henry sat beside her, his figure tense, his face the mask of contradictions that I read like an open book. He didn't know where to look, what to feel, and that was the hardest thing to bear. He was broken, yet he didn't realize whom he had truly lost. He didn't understand that this moment was the result of choices we had both made, choices that had led us here, year after year. I turned my gaze away from him and focused on the judge as he called the court to order. The proceedings began, and I felt as though my entire life had been condensed into this narrow corridor. The trial was exhausting and emotional. Every moment stretched into eternity, yet I could feel the decision approaching, pressing down on me. The prosecutor, step by step, methodically and with restraint, laid out the evidence against Laura. His voice grew more confident as he painted a picture of a ruthless, calculating woman who would stop at nothing to get her way. The true turning point, however, came with the testimony of Brian Cox's family. When his mother, a frail, silver-haired woman, took the witness stand, she spoke about her son, about the kind, vibrant person he had been, about the future he had ahead of him, coolly and abruptly cut short. But it was her words that brought me to a final realization. She spoke of how her son, so full of life, had been consumed by Laura's controlling and abusive behavior. She recounted how Laura isolated Brian from his family and friends, manipulated him, and kept him all to herself. The words of Brian's sister, spoken through tears, echoed in my mind, piercing through the fog of my thoughts. She described how Laura had made his life unbearable, how the warm, bright person he had been before meeting her began to fade, replaced by a shadow of fear and loneliness. She spoke of how he became trapped, how his entire world shrank to revolve around this cruel woman who deceived everyone around her. My heart ached with what I felt. Yes, Laura was guilty, but Henry was also part of this story. His indifference, his refusal to see the truth, had played its role. I tried to focus on the testimony, on the here and now, but thoughts of my son, of the faith I had once had in him, of how I had protected him, wouldn't let me go. And then, in that moment, as the family's testimony resonated with raw, emotional power, I felt the tide turn. This wasn't just a trial, it was a battle in which Laura could no longer hide. Her lies, her manipulations, her control, everything she had built over the years was now crumbling. Henry sat beside her, and I watched as his face gradually lost all confidence. He was still trying to find some way out, some path to avoid the consequences, but it was too late. There was no going back. For any of us. All my life, I had been a witness to injustice and pain, but this trial, it was different. It wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a reckoning, a cleansing for all of us, and especially for me. The trial had dragged on for weeks, but now, as I sat in that courtroom, feeling the weight of every glance, every word, I knew we were at the edge. Laura sat at the defendant's table, her eyes fixed on me, but the fire that had once burned in them was gone. She was broken, though she still clung desperately to her defiance. I knew she wouldn't give up, but her manipulations, her attempts to control and intimidate, were futile now. She sat before the judge, her fate no longer in her hands but dictated by the mistakes she had made. I sat there, reflecting on everything. Henry, with his exhausted face, wouldn't take his eyes off me. I saw how his hands clenched into fists, how he was desperately trying to make sense of what was happening but couldn't. We had all come a long way, and now we were at the brink. But I couldn't be the one to look away, to pretend everything was fine. I knew this wasn't just a trial, it was a matter of honor, a matter of restoring justice. When the prosecutor finished his argument, presenting the final pieces of evidence and witness testimonies, it was my turn. I stood and walked to the stand, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. The entire courtroom fell silent, every gaze fixed on me. I don't know how to explain what's happening, I began, my voice quieter than I had expected. I lost my son, I lost myself, I lost everything. But at some point, I realized that if I didn't do this, if I didn't stand for the truth, then nothing else would matter. This isn't just my fight, it's a fight for those she destroyed, for those she manipulated, for those who believed her lies. I can't let her walk away without accountability. My words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. I looked around the courtroom and saw everyone watching me intently. But in that moment, I felt only myself. I had to finish what I had started. The prosecutor rose and, adding his closing statements, affirmed that everything had been proven. And finally, when the last blow had been struck, Laura was led away, and her fate was sealed. A few days later, headlines appeared in the press that I hadn't even dared to dream of. Laura was found guilty of multiple crimes, including manipulation, fraud, and even offenses against her own husband that she had managed to conceal for years. Henry, crushed under the weight of the truth, was forced to confront the consequences of his choices. He had lost everything, his family, his reputation, his faith in people. I received countless messages, letters, and words of gratitude from those who had known of our struggles but now saw how justice had been restored with her downfall. My grandchildren were now safe, and I could finally teach them that there is not only darkness in the world, but also light. I was no longer the woman my son had once abandoned. I had become strong, resolute, and now I could face the future without fear. Henry and Laura had been the blade that stabbed into my heart, but I had pulled it out, and now I had no choice but to live on. Without regrets.